Good morning. I really appreciate you being here this morning. I need to just do one thing here. Okay, great. I really appreciate you being here today and joining me for my photography talk, how COVID-19 opened my eyes to the world around me. And among other things in life, I'm a photographer. But before we get started, I also want to thank the Creativity Conference for giving me this platform to speak about my work. You know, when I was first invited to the first Creativity Conference, which took place early in the year, I was pretty reluctant to talk because, like many of us in the creative space, I can suffer from acute imposter syndrome and, often rightly ask, what could I possibly have to say? But were you to meet the founder of the conference, Maxim, you would find he's an incredibly charismatic gentleman, and when you're with him, you find yourself agreeing to things that you didn't quite expect to. So here we go. Let's begin. When I was a kid, all I wanted to do was be a photojournalist and travel the world. And why that dream didn't entirely work out the way I expected it to. It has taken me to places like Rwanda, where I've been able to work on issues related to women's education. It's permitted me to travel to places like India, where I've been able to have tea with total strangers, to China, where I'm continuously confronted by differences from where I've grown up and been raised. But even places where I was raised, like Brooklyn, which was a neighborhood that was Italian, and over the past 40 years has transformed into more of an Arab community. And of course, I've spent a lot of time working on as a citizen journalist, and I've covered lots of social movements like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matters. But did you know that I have an 83-year-old neighbor named Sally in Burbank? And I didn't, because I was never around. I was always too busy to say hi and too hurried to even really see what was around me. But it turns out she's super sweet. And during the pandemic, I've gotten an opportunity to spend some time with her, just chatting as I walk by. So I can't speak for you, but my 2019 was one great party, and it was, I think one of the best years that I'd ever had. But my 2020 and my 2021 look something more like this, and our lives pretty much changed overnight. Suddenly, our normal lives, going to the movies, dancing, going out to dinner, suddenly changed. Everybody was suddenly wearing a mask. And I just was, pretty stunned by, just this really dramatic change. In fact, so much so that even the Olympic mascots were forced to give in and mask up. And I think another component of, the COVID era, was a lot of anxiety. You probably spent a lot of time, like me, being anxious of COVID, being tested, and if not, knowing someone who was, and people getting sick, and unfortunately, quite a lot of people dying of this disease. And obviously, we're the lucky ones who are still here, as millions have died in the pandemic, and this is something that's still going. But out of this, I think it's given me a lot of reflection about how to live. And so one thing is that I think it's important to honor people by living and with, passion and authenticity. So as a traveler by nature and a photographer, people, in this context, being told that you need to cool your jets is a very difficult thing to do. Not being able to travel is really a big, rapid change in my life, since all I've ever done is travel the world and take pictures of people in faraway places. And while in the grand scheme of things, I'm smart enough to know that, more important things are happening, And whether or not I get to travel is a fairly petty concern, given the scope of things, what's happening. But a big component of being alive for me is being creative, and being able to create was imperative to me. But my methodology, which was interacting with people and being a source of creative inspiration, was suddenly cut off. And it's often said that out of constraint comes creativity. And so for me, it started with a walk in my neighborhood, where, among other things, I met Sally. But also, I ended up in a small park about a mile away from my condo, where there was a dense patch of succulents growing. And for reasons I really can't explain, and also just because I was desperately searching for something to photograph because the streets were empty, I was drawn to it. And over the next several months, this plant in particular would become a feature in my daily effort to learn about how to shoot a new type of subject, and to be stiller and calmer with myself. And we developed a relationship over time. I eventually named her Gladys. And I visited this location often, and as you can see, we've both matured. Gladys in size, and hopefully me in personal growth. By watching this plant mature, I've connected with, I guess, the transient nature of life itself. And I think it's made me more conscious of things like climate change, and has made me look at my habits, locally, as opposed to driving. I spend a lot more time walking, and it has allowed me to continue to see things like this. This walking has certainly opened up my eyes to things that are just little details along the street, which prior to COVID, I had never, ever even, taken the time to glance at, even though one of my roles as a photographer is to see. So one of the interesting things out of this is that succulents, something I'd never photographed before, have become a complete obsession. And they come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and experimenting with that, I see them locally. And I've traveled to places like Joshua Tree to photograph them. And I've been able to just also creatively, one of the things I've been able to do is that in photojournalism, there's a kind of, adherence to some rules. One is that, you don't modify the pictures creatively. You're really more documenting, so you're taking pictures of what you see. But with the succulents, one of the things that's really come out of that is more of a ability to be creatively manipulative, in the sense of really working with things like extreme contrast, and which is bringing out details that you wouldn't necessarily inherently see just by looking at the plant. And then, of course, as you can see, the medium is black and white, which for me is my medium of choice. And so I just, I don't know, I feel, as I say, more connected to, I guess, the earth, and fortunately, with respect to succulents in California, they're everywhere. And so I am able to take in a lot of detail in my everyday world that I wasn't able to see. And I have Gladys to thank for this. So another thing that COVID has taught me is to slow down, perhaps, and think about taking the road less traveled. How many times in my car have I driven between Los Angeles and San Francisco, or Las Vegas at 80 miles an hour, never stopping to see the little things. And now, when it says something like Vista Point, I'm kind of stopping to take a look. This particular photo is somewhere in the middle of that drive between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And sadly, the actual vista point itself is used by many of these visitors to relieve themselves, and there's trash. So in the hot sun, you know, you really want to gag on the smell. But the view is amazing, and I really love it. This photo is I was on my way to see poppy fields, which bloom in the spring in California. And you know, you're looking for these great orange fields, which I realize as a black and white photographer seems counterintuitive to want to seek out. But I had something creatively in mind, but I never quite got there because I took a turn because I saw something, and then you know I ended up at this farm where there was a bunch of old equipment in this silo. And I never got to see the poppies, so I assumed that they bloomed, but I wouldn't know about it. And I've made forays to dystopic places. This area is called the Salton Sea, which is kind of on the edge of nowhere, past Palm Springs, out towards the desert. It's sort of this weird kind of abandoned area with a lot of artists. I've spent a lot of time trying to learn about the people and the sculpture and all the art that's being created out there. Again, in the context of taking the road less traveled, you know, I had to drive to Portland, where I did try to document the protests that were going on last year, which, you know, gave me a lot of anxiety because you know, being older, I'm a little concerned about, you know, catching COVID. But along the way, you know, I spent some time to take exits just randomly. And this one I was particularly drawn to in the morning. I don't know what, you know, I didn't know what was going to be at the bottom of the hill when I got off the freeway, but I ended up taking this landscape, which again is another area. I've just never done landscapes or anything like that because I've always just concentrated on people. And COVID's also taught me the, I guess, exercise in patience. I think for all of us, you know, we've spent a lot of time waiting for, you know, something to change, and yet it's the same thing every day after day. And I think what I've learned to do is to just observe places and patiently wait to see what happens. So this is near Sunrise in Korea, where I did end up spending part of the pandemic. And this is the same location about 10 hours later. And, you know, not a particularly dramatic photo, but in a sense, though, a really good exercise for me to think about, you know, how just everything just changes over time. So I've also tried to work with elements, you know, beyond the land and the landscape. I've tried to work with elements like wind, which is something that I had never contemplated being able to do. And worked on a series of these are Japanese fabrics that are hanging over a river, and they just let the wind, you know, just sort of blow. And so I spent, you know, just a whole day just watching these and working on a variety of images for that. And to shoot the stars. So another element being the sky and the universe around us. Something I've never done is astrophotography. And so I got to travel to places like, which, you know, are more devoid of people, like Joshua Tree, and just look at the stars. And again, being a black and white photographer, you know, my historical experience with star photography, as far as observing it, has just been in the black and white context. So it was really nice to see, you know, what could be done. And of course, though I've lived in cities and worked in cities and traveled to cities, I have never really looked at buildings as a photographic subject. And so this was a new area that I was also able to explore. And basically to see that buildings are actors in our lives just as much as the people around us are. Also, I've learned to be experimental. This is, it may not be obvious, so I will explain. It's a freight train near Niland, California, which is also in the Salton Sea. And that has just sort of opened up this door to, using time lapse or long exposures in a way that I have. So this is taken near Santa Barbara. But I think maybe the most important thing that I've learned, and I think this is a lesson that I'm continuing to learn, and because I'm trying to have humility, is that I'm always trying to be kinder and to listen harder. This photo is a woman named Donita, and she lives with her husband Bill on the edge of the world near Salvation Mountain, which is out in the Salton Sea, and next to a place also called Slab City. And as you can infer from the photo, they live off the grid, and they don't have much money. And they got married in a small ceremony last year. And at the time, even though they were all dressed up with their best wedding clothes, no one took the time to make any photos of their big day. And so they didn't really have any record of it, but they had fond memories of it. So I asked them, if they still had their wedding clothes, to which they had replied yes. So, I suggested that maybe we have a photo shoot in those clothes, so that they would have something to remember. And though they were busy that day, they asked me if I could come back the following day. And I was staying nearby. This place is pretty far from Los Angeles, but I happened to be staying in Palm Springs at the time, about an hour or so away from where they were. So I readily agreed, and we scheduled for the next day. And so, we made a number of shots. We had a little photo session, and it was really a lot of fun. And so, the thing at the end of it is, I'm shooting digital, they're out in the middle of nowhere. And so, how are we going to make photos physically happen so that they have memories? So I went back to Los Angeles, where I've been working for the last several months. And I worked on selecting the right images, doing some touch up, and I made a series of prints for them. So the following week, I drove out and intended to hand them all off in person. And I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. And it's not the kind of place where you can just drop off a pack of prints. It's very windy, and I was worried they'd be lost somehow. But I drove around for another hour, came back, and luckily they were home. And it was so gratifying to see their faces light up and looking at their images. That for me, I teared up, and I was just really so pleased, because it was just something really nice. And I think in a year of really bad, it was a really gratifying experience to explain, or to take in. And so, I don't know what normal is going to be or what it is anymore. Clearly, I think we're going to be working with a great deal of adjustment. But I'm hopeful that eventually we'll be able to do things that we really enjoy, and go back to the movies. But at times that can seem really trying. But I think it's important to just take in and look closely at the details around you, to take the time to immerse yourself in art. If you can, make sure to support artists, and since you're here today, I think it's clear that you do. And to remember that we only have one life, and we should make the most of it. And I'm really grateful for COVID really flipping the script in terms of how I look at photography, and allowing me to see a whole bunch of things that I would have never even considered. And I think as I go back into photographing people, it's going to have a great influence on my work. And so that's what I learned, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was wonderful. You are an exceptional photographer.
Thank you.
And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them up in the chat. We do have time for a Q&A, so now would be the best time. Well, even if you're typing out your question, I just want to say thank you so much to Robert. Oh, here we go. Are you able to see that?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm kind of.
No.
No.
I can read it out loud for you. No
Yeah,
worries.
that'd be great. Yeah.
All right. So we have a question from Pernil. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Pernil Fraser. Stunning work, thank you. I was just wondering if you hand printed your work.
Well, generally, that's another interesting thing. Most of my work is digitally processed and shared and stuff like that. But during the pandemic, I invested fairly heavily in a printer of some quality, and that's when I made the prints for Danita and Bill. I took them out there to hand them to them. So it's made me also, I think, really want to have more tangible content and hang them on walls, and because the work, one challenge, and I don't know what your viewing situation is like, but one challenge I find is that when you're using Instagram or social media, or people reading content on their phone, the photos are so small, and you can't really take in the detail. And so when you look at, that's why I think galleries are so important, and I think that's what's been a real big big thing that's been missing in a lot of people's lives, because when you're able to really stop and take in a photo, I think you really learn a lot more about what the intention or your inference of the intention of the photographer is, or your response to the photo is a lot different, because I think it channels emotion a lot differently than looking at a tiny image. So the answer was historically no, but going forward, yes, I think.
Thank you. And then Cynthia, we'll try to get to all of the questions. Cynthia is asking, as a media teacher, do you recommend students make the rule of thirds a good principle of shooting photos, or should rule of thirds be thrown out the window? Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not really a person who likes to talk about gear or the equipment I use, because I think a lot of stuff is about what you see, as opposed to, following rules or so forth. But I happen to work with Leica cameras, which are rangefinders, and one specific thing about them is that they have an optical viewfinder as opposed to using a mirror or a prism, and so they have, depending on the focal length you're using, they provide frame lines within the viewer, and those change based on the focal length. So if you're using say a 35mm lens, you have frame lines, but you have stuff outside the frame lines as well, so you can see what's in the frame and what's out of the frame. And so for me, that's a particularly useful way of working, because I think it allows you to anticipate things that are going to happen a lot more easily. Whereas if you're looking through a prism, you're really in a boxed view and can't anticipate stuff. So that's one aspect of how I work. I think it's important to have a technical mastery of all of the skills and compositional thoughts that people have about photography. So I do think the rule of thirds is important to understand conceptually, and for a period of time, learn how to use it. Because if you master it, then when you step outside of that, it's intentional, as opposed to accidental. And I think one of the things that you want to do artistically is have control of your medium. And so I think it's often important to have that sort of foundational stuff, so that, you know, when you depart from it, you know why you're departing from it. And it's not just some happy accident, that it's something that you could do again intentionally.